Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Wilson Library, and thank you for coming out. I'm Steve Weiss. I'm the curator of the Southern Folklife Collection, and it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's author talk with Kristina Gaddy on her book, Well of Souls, Uncovering the Banjo's Hidden History. This work is an extraordinary story unfolding across 200 years, where Kristina has uncovered the banjo's key role in Black spirituality, ritual, and rebellion. And before I introduce Kristina, I'd like to thank Shaw Lentz, Katie Fanfani, and Deborah Zombar for their help in the arrangements for this event. This is our first in-person event, the Southern Folklife Collection's first in-person event since the fall of 2019. So we're very glad to be here with you. Now to introduce Kristina. So Kristina Gaddy is an award-winning author who believes in the power of narrative nonfiction to bring stories from the past to life, to inform the world we live in today. Her debut nonfiction book, Flowers in the Gutter, tells the true story of the teenage Edelweiss pirates who fought the Nazis. She holds an MFA in a nonfiction writing from Goucher College, and her work has appeared in the Washington Post, Baltimore Magazine, Washington City Paper, Baltimore Sun, and other publications. In her free time, she weaves on a beautiful 8-harness floor loom from her great aunt Susie, plays fiddle with her partner and banjo maker Pete Ross, and sits on the board of the Baltimore City Historical Society and is also on the planning committee of the Banjo Gathering. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for inviting me. I like how you said that Pete is my banjo maker. He is my banjo maker. He's also my partner. He couldn't make it tonight, but I'm going to talk a little bit about this instrument that, well, actually, he didn't make it for me. This is a banjo. Might not look like people think a banjo should look. Rather than kind of that wooden rim body, we have this gourd. But it does have a lot of the characteristics that we think of when we talk about or think about banjos, namely the short string, long strings, a flat fingerboard. Unlike contemporary bluegrass or old-time banjos, the historical record suggests that these instruments had 4 strings instead of 5, so 3 long and 1 short. And this one is kind of a historic creation. It was specifically made for the Underground Railroad miniseries based on Colson Whitehead's book. And they wanted an instrument that could have appeared in South Carolina, around 1800. And so they commissioned Pete to make it, and he wanted it to look well worn. So you can see that, the head he's painted. It does have a skin head like contemporary banjos do. And then he added some kind of symbolism that I had turned up in my research for this book from South Carolina that's related to the Gullah Geechee culture that is on the Sea Islands. One of the reasons that this is a historic recreation, reimagining, and not an actual instrument is because there are only 4 known gourd banjos from this early period that exist today. They are all in European collections, museum collections. None of them are playable. And can't be made playable because if you were to string them up, you might damage the gourd, right? This is something that's easily cracked. I was very scared flying with it today that somebody was going to crack it in that overhead compartment. And So they can't be put into playable condition. So in order to hear what they sounded like, we have to make these reproductions, either reproductions of those existing instruments, including the one that's on the cover, which is referred to as the Haitian banjo. It's in the Musée de la Musique in Paris currently. And we have to make a recreation or a reproduction in order to hear that sound. And so before I play something on this so that we can hear that sound, I also want to just kind of, in a beginning part, think about, the banjo's roots are African. And these are a number of instruments that share common traits with the banjo. So the accounting is one that folks usually know more about because the playing style that the Dola play on that is very similar to old-time clawhammer downstroking banjo. But you have a number of instruments that have gourd bodies, flat fingerboards, tuning pegs, short and long strings, all of the things that we see on a banjo. But what makes this special is that none of those characteristics appear together on one instrument. So those things that I just pointed out, the short and the long strings, the flat fingerboard and the gourd body, and also a very specific thing that I go into a lot in the book about how the neck meets the gourd. And I'll say that this one is not, again, it's not a reproduction. So it's been modified slightly from that original reproduction, the intent of the original creators. So that's just the brief overview with some images there. And I want to start off by playing a tune that was transcribed in 1687 in Jamaica. It comes out of a book that was published by a man named Sir Hans Sloane. He was a doctor who went to Jamaica and was really fascinated with the culture that he saw there, including the culture of the enslaved people. And so even from this earliest image of banjos, numbers 1 and 2 there, you can see that they have these characteristics: short and long strings, flat fingerboard, gourd body, how we think the neck would have met the gourd. He did collect those and bring them back to England, and they were once part of the British Museum, but they have since been lost. But he also asked Mr. Baptiste, a Black musician, at one of the festivals in Jamaica to transcribe some music. And so he says, "I desired Mr. Baptiste, the best musician there, to take the words they sung and set them to music, which follows. You must clap your hands when the bass is played and cry Allah, Allah." And so there's 3 different pieces, and I'm going to play the second one there at the bottom that's titled Papa. And you can tell it's a really short piece, but it kind of begs to be repeated over and over again. So I'm going to start with reading a little bit from the prelude to the book, the introduction, to kind of explain how this book came to be, my approach to researching it. Centered between 2 small houses, somewhere in swampy lowlands next to a creek, 3 people begin to dance. A woman in a green dress bends over slightly. She lifts her heels, stirring the sandy ground beneath her feet. Suspended between her hands, she holds a white and blue striped cloth pinched between her index fingers and thumb. Next to her, another woman dances, a cloth outstretched between her hands. They dance on their toes. They look like they're floating. The women face a man. He's bent over too, with a dark wooden dowel in his hands. He raises and lowers the staff as he moves his feet, his blue jacket rising as he lifts his arms, his bare feet and red pants gliding across the makeshift stage. 2 instruments drive the music of this dance. To the left of the dancers sits a man with a drum pressed between his knees. To his right, a man in a hat sits with the round body of a stringed instrument squarely in his lap. The tan, dried gourd amplifies the sounds that burst from the strings. To modern eyes, this instrument may not look like a banjo. It has no circular wooden body, no metal parts. Instead, a flat piece of wood bisects a round gourd, forming the neck and sound chamber. A piece of animal skin sits taut across a circular hole cut into the side of the gourd. Around this white circle, the maker has cut intersecting lines. Strings extend from the bottom of the gourd across the soundboard, over a bridge that holds them up, and along the board-like neck to where it comes to a triangular point. The short string, flat fingerboard, skin soundboard, and tuning pegs are some of the banjo's defining characteristics. When the white slave owner John Rose saw this scene of enslaved Black people before 1790, he felt it was interesting enough to commit to paper. And there's care in his work, in his brushstrokes with the people's movements. Looking at it, you feel almost instinctively that something significant is happening. In the years since it was first displayed, the image has gained the title, The Old Plantation, and has been reprinted in books, on museum walls, and on CD and record covers. This rare piece of art is one of the most significant images of early African-American music dance in North America, and one of the earliest images of the banjo. Most scholars and historians have assumed that what Rose painted was a social dance or a secular celebration. Some have suggested that 2 of the dancers are jumping the broom, a marriage ceremony among enslaved Blacks in the United States. This reading seems wrong. The painting has no broom. Moreover, the broom ceremony was not a tradition in Africa, hasn't been documented during the period of the painting, and is a folk custom likely introduced to the Americas by Europeans. Other scholars have simply accepted that the painting depicts an African dance, even though searches for an analogous dance in Africa have yielded no results. Yet no one has definitively said what the dance is. In 2017, my partner Pete Ross and I wandered through the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, which explores 800 years of Dutch history through visual and decorative arts. Pete and I play a sort of game in art museums, a kind of treasure hunt that we had always lost. A trained artist and luthier, Pete had spent decades staring at images of early banjos, researching early banjo accounts, and making gourd banjo recreations and reproductions for museums and musicians. Each time we visit a museum, we joke, today we are going to find an image of a banjo that no one has noticed before. The idea of finding a lost banjo image always feels both ludicrous and hopeful. On one hand, how would we discover something new in a painting that has been hanging on a museum wall and been seen by thousands of people every day? Surely we would have known of it already, or we could find it on the internet with a simple search. On the other hand, we know that the banjo's early history, its African-American history, has been willfully hidden and distorted. Only 3 early gourd-bodied African-American, and I say 3 here because one was discovered during the course of this book, exist today, and Pete and I are the only people to have examined all 3. It wasn't until the 1970s that the white librarian Dina Epstein published a book outlining pre-Civil War sources that mentioned Black banjo playing. And she admitted that even after looking through tens of thousands of pages of documents, she still hadn't mined every source. Known images of the banjo before 1820 number less than 15. This all makes it feel like we could find a treasure in our game. We chose the room of Dutch colonial art because 2 of the 3 earliest banjos are from the South American nation of Suriname, formerly Dutch Guyana. We thought the art would expand the landscape of Suriname for us and might help us understand those banjos better. Entering the room, we saw a wall of dioramas, each about as wide as a dining room table. As I moved from one intricate papier-mâché scene of Suriname in the early 1800s to the next, I felt like I had been transported. Then I saw it. There it is, I said, astonished. He's no bigger than my thumb, a Black man leaning against a tree. He wears white plants, a blue shirt, and a headdress of feathers. He tucks an instrument into his right shoulder. It can't be bigger than my fingernail, but there it is, a gourd banjo. I read the information card. Bacio comes from Paramaribo, 1820 by Garrett Schouten. I coaxed Pete over. He looked less excited than I thought he should. His disposition is calmer than mine, but he also wasn't convinced that the instrument was interesting. Feeling that this was probably just another inexact or caricatured version of the banjo, he moved on. I started snapping photos with my phone anyway, trying to get the largest version of the man I could. Pete wandered over to the next diorama. I don't remember his exact words, but holy shit is a favorite expletive. That's it. That's the old plantation, he said. Here was something almost identical to the John Rose watercolor. The fact that there was no banjo didn't matter, nor did it matter that the scene was in South America rather than South Carolina. I snapped a few more photos, and in the gift shop, we bought a book on Schouten and the dioramas. We didn't open it until we got home to Baltimore, but when I dived into it, the next holy shit moment occurred. The book led me to sources and information about the cultural context of the banjo that had been forgotten. And what we learned through this book is that this dance was called the banya, spelled Banya, which was the same name given to early banjos in Suriname. And I knew that there had to be a connection between this dance, that instrument, that name, and the South Carolina watercolor. And so I went down a deep rabbit hole trying to explore that. The banjo is the quintessential American instrument and an object in our material culture that can tell us the story of the United States. The banjo did not exist before it was created by the hands of enslaved people in the New World. Banjo history is also symbolic of African American history. It has been ignored and distorted. The rabbit hole I went down made me realize that, like a creolized language or foodway, the banjo can help us explore the ways in which African cultures transformed in the Americas and transformed the Americas. I compulsively researched banjo accounts of the early banjo, which are scarce because those playing the instrument often didn't have the opportunity to record their own history, and white people in proximity to the instrument often didn't care to document banjos. I read and reread every available source for descriptions that might be valuable and rediscovered lost sources, ones historians, researchers, and librarians had used in pursuits of other topics, but not to analyze early American music. Along the way, I became frustrated that white supremacy had distorted this history and that better sources didn't exist. I used these sources to understand the context in which the banjo was played and tried to interrogate the bias of writers and observers by learning more about them and the world they lived in. I also looked at my own bias as a Swedish American white woman trying to understand a culture that isn't my own, but is integral to American culture. Our biases have limited the banjo to being a secular instrument. It is in the hands of a lone white man on a porch, a backup instrument in a bluegrass band, or a driver of melodies for a square dance or clogging routine. The assumption is that the banjo must have always been a secular instrument. This is putting a Eurocentric worldview on an instrument born of African beliefs and traditions. From my research, I realized that the banjo once served a higher purpose. The instrument was sacred. The banjo was not just a musical instrument, but a spiritual device, and it fit into a complex of music, dance, and spirituality. In this book, I hope to reveal that cultural complex and to have the banjo take us on a journey to remember the hidden, the willfully ignored, the forgotten, and the lost. And one of those lost things that I explore a lot in the book is the relationship between the banjo and rebellion and resistance. And so I have chapters very specifically about that and bring that theme throughout. But another record that we get of the banjo are in these rather disturbing advertisements that are commonly called runaway slave advertisements. And that's where an owner puts out, an ad that says this person ran away. Here's what they're dressed like. Here's their distinguishing features. Here's what they might have taken with them. And from those, we get accounts of banjo players and fiddlers and other musicians. But a particular interest to this is banjo players. And I write about one banjo player who ran away in Maryland, which is where I live. But I also found it interesting that in this 1790s selection of Scotch, English, Irish, and foreign airs, there's a song that's called Pompey Ran Away, and it's titled A Negro Jig, suggesting that it comes from the African American tradition. And I'm going to play that on the gourd banjo. And being here in North Carolina, I wanted to talk a little bit about those traditions that are documented here. One of the things that folks have asked me, the book came out last October, I guess. I don't know. It's been a blur. Is about kind of the how I chose the chapters. It starts in 1687 and ends ostensibly in starts in 1687, ends in 1867. And I'll read a little bit from the end of that so you can understand why that's the period that I chose to end in. But in each of the chapters, I really focus on one account of the banjo. And of course, in nonfiction writing, that means that we have to have enough material to be able to write about that in depth and detail. And so while there are other accounts of the banjo besides the ones I've written about here, oftentimes it's just, oh, there was a Black man playing a banjo, or, oh, there was a banjo player, without any other information, without any other context. And it really couldn't serve to tell a story. And so then there's also a lot of kind of triangulation within that to tell a story when we don't have a lot. But I want to talk about a tradition that existed both in the Caribbean and was associated with the banjo and here in North Carolina. So we are in Jamaica in the 1750s. And I've just written a little bit about a slave owner, a really brutal, awful slave owner named Thomas Thistlewood. Edward Long arrived in Jamaica not long after Thistlewood. Unlike Thistlewood, Long already had connections to the island, and as his father, owned a plantation, and quickly established himself in Jamaican society by marrying a plantation-owning widow. His writings on Jamaica are also the opposite of Thistlewood's. Where Thistlewood wrote private notes in his own shorthand, Long published 3 volumes under the title History of Jamaica, or General Survey of the Ancient and Modern State of that Island in 1774. Here he made note of the favorite instrument of the enslaved, the merry-wang. This rustic guitar of 4 strings is made of a calabash, a slice of which has been taken off. A dried bladder or skin is spread across the largest section, and this is fastened to a handle, which they take great pains in ornamenting with a sort of rude carved work and ribbands. Neither Thistlewood nor Long explained the name Merry-Wang, but it appears similar to the lyrics Merry Walanga, which Mr. Baptiste wrote down for one of the songs Coromantee. Long observed different Christmas traditions from Thistlewood. He wrote that men in town would dress up in grotesque outfits, meaning a combination of human and animal forms, with a pair of ox horns on their heads sprouting from the top of a horrid visor or mask, which about the mouth is rendered very terrific with boar tusks. The man in the costume carried a wooden sword and danced at every door, bellowing out, "John Canoe." Women followed behind him, offering him alcoholic aniseed water. Long thought that the dance is probably a memorial of John Conny, a celebrated cabocero on the Guinea coast. John Conny was a chief and trader on the Gold Coast who fought against the Dutch for the right to trade around 1720. He added the title king to his name, a variant of the Dutch koning. Sometimes the celebration was called Jonkanu. And so this tradition continues on today, but this is also an 1837 image featuring 3 percussionists and the caption, Band of the Jawbone Jonkanu. And now I want to take us much farther into the future. To 1862, we're back on the South Carolina Sea Islands. And I'm telling a story about a woman, a 19-year-old named Lucy McKim. Her father was an abolitionist, and he went to Port Royal in an effort to educate, house, clothe, and feed the newly freed people that were in Union-occupied South Carolina Sea Islands. Lucy McKim was, she at one point wrote to her friend and said that she wanted to dress up as a man and enlist in the Union Army. She was, had grown up a devoted abolitionist. Her friend Ellie had hung a picture of John Brown in her boarding school dorm room. And so she jumps at the opportunity to go down to the Sea Islands in order to, kind of do what she thinks could be her part in the war effort. McKim had come as her father's assistant and was fascinated by all she heard and saw. She believed that sharing the music she heard the Black people singing would bring out their humanity to whites. Lucy went to a praise and a shout, religious ceremonies unique to the Sea Islands. While a praise felt more like a typical church service, a shout incorporated music and dancing. Those gathered pushed benches to the side of the church cabin, and the best singer, the one who could improvise new lyrics, might start with, "Pray all the member," the first line to a common shout song. Other men would bass hymn, singing back the chorus lines and interjectionals like, "Oh Lord." At the praises, attendees sang hymns that Baptists or Methodists across the South knew. But at the shout, they had their own songs that the McKims had never heard before. Much had changed here since John Rose painted people dancing 80 years earlier. In the 1780s and 90s, one man noted that most of the enslaved people in South Carolina were great strangers to Christianity, and Sundays and holidays were used for the purposes of dancing, feasting, and merriment. That merriment wasn't irreverence. It was reverence for spirits, communicating with ancestors, and gathering of spiritual community. While the Great Awakening had swept through much of the British North American colonies and drew people into Protestant Christianity in the first half of the 18th century, the movement had little impact on whites in the Sea Islands and even less on African-descended people. It wasn't until the latter part of the Second Great Awakening that religious practices started to change in this area. Baptist and Methodist conversions and teaching began in the 1830s, taking hold in the 1840s and through 60s. Sometimes a slave owner allowed for a praise house. If they didn't, people snuck into the woods to a brush or hush arbor designated by an upside-down pot to gather for services which blended the older African and African-American spiritual traditions with Christianity. Like those people who snuck away to dance the kalinda, people here went to secret meetings and not always on Sundays. The preacher could speak of God and Jesus and teach the Bible, but worshipers could also dance in a ring as a way to commune with God. What was absent in the praise house was any instrument. For hundreds of years, drums, fiddles, banjos, and wind instruments were part of these religious dances. Now, as a result of conversion to Christianity, there were none. What Rose had seen was a spiritual dance, and central to it was the banjo, just as the instrument was in Suriname and Haiti. But the banjo and the fiddle in Christianity didn't seem to mix. When Swedish author Fredrika Bremer visited the United States between 1849 and 1851, she wanted to hear the music of the enslaved. In Augusta, Georgia, after an old enslaved man named Romeo sang her a death song, a young man who was not so evangelical as the rest came and sang with his banjo. Around the same time as Bremer's visit to Georgia, another man said 20 violins had been destroyed by a Methodist missionary in the state. Writing about her experience as a white girl on a plantation in Mississippi, Susan Dabney Smeads remembered that when enslaved people joined the Baptist church, they stopped playing instruments. The most music-loving fellow told the preacher that he'd broken his fiddle and banjo and thrown them away. Traditions that seem secular, but which might have been spiritual practices, couldn't easily be blended with Christianity and were disappearing too. Harriet Jacobs had been born enslaved in 1813, but published her memoir as a free woman in 1861. As a girl in eastern North Carolina, she remembered that they rose early on Christmas morning to see the Junkanoo. Two men led the procession of dancers dressed in calico wrappers, over which they wore a net that was covered in bright-colored stripes. They wore cow tails and horns. Some men beat on the gumbo box, which was a box made to look like a drum with a sheepskin cover, like had been seen in Congo Square and in Jamaica. Others played triangles and jawbones. Jacobs does not give a reason for the disappearance of the Junkanoos, but one man said it was the Black preachers who stopped the practice, since it degraded the Blacks in the eyes of the white people of the community. And this is, it says dressing for Carnival 1877 Winslow Homer, but people have suggested that this was kind of a conversion of that Junkanoo tradition after the Civil War that continued. It's supposed to be a scene in Virginia. Lucy McKim knew that the Civil War and the end of slavery would fundamentally change the United States for the better. She also knew that collecting the songs created and passed down during slavery was important. Soon, that music might be gone. And so after she visits South Carolina, she comes home, she transcribes a few songs that she hears. She comes home and she plays these songs for William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist, who was a personal family friend. She gets a few of these songs published in a publication called Dwight's Music Journal. And she starts writing to others in this like very pointed way of, I want to collect these songs and I want to put them into a book because we're really going to lose this music and this culture as things start to change after freedom comes. And so she ends up marrying one of William Lloyd Garrison's sons. And so in 1867, together with William Francis Allen and Charles Pickard Ware, they published Slave Songs of the United States, which is the first book of published African-American music in the United States. And one of the songs that they get from one of their correspondences is a song called Kalinda. And the Kalinda was a dance that had been documented in the Caribbean since at least the 1690s. And there's a 1783 version where you can see a lot of the body movements are very similar to other images of dances that we've seen. And so I'm going to play Kalinda for us. You can't tell. I think that one begs for percussion accompaniment. Slave Songs was published just 2 years after the end of the war in 1867. And within 5 years, white people were already writing about hearing fewer of the songs that had seemed so ubiquitous in the early 1860s. At the same time, music traditions, both secular and religious, provided material for a growing number of Black professional musicians, from touring groups like the Fisk Jubilee Singers to songwriter James Bland. Some of the selections of slave songs would become known around the world, sung a century later in the street marches of the civil rights movement or on the stages of country music's Grand Ole Opry by white performers. Others still have lived obscurely in the pages of the collection, songs that someone heard, thought important enough to write down and preserve, and hopefully to be revived and appreciated, reevaluated, and better understood one day. And Lucy was kind of already right in her idea that she had starting in 1862, because while they wanted to publish the slave songs of the United States, they actually wanted to do a second collection. A lot of the songs in slave songs are of religious nature. And they had a hard time finding songs that they thought were secular, which her co-writer Allen described as of intrinsically barbaric character, songs that may very well be purely African in origin. Allen claimed that all the world knows the banjo and the Jim Crow songs of 30 years ago, referencing Blackface Minstrelsy. He thought that those songs, tainted by Blackface Minstrelsy, didn't seem authentic. Even though they wanted to put together a second volume of secular songs, they couldn't find enough, a problem that encapsulates the history of the banjo around the same time. On the one hand, they may not have been able to find secular songs in Black communities because religious music had replaced them. On the other, secular Black music had been both co-opted by white musicians on the minstrel stage and used by professional Black musicians, removing the songs from any perceived folk tradition. And so what happens is I kind of skipped over a portion of starting in the 1840s, you get white musicians putting on Black burnt cork makeup, imitating Black people, and getting on stage and doing these lampooning characteristics. And the banjo really became a prop of that, a prop of Blackness. This was an instrument that was so associated with the African American community that people could use it on stage simply as that type of prop. But there were also musicians who were playing it on stage. And if I had driven, I would have brought my kind of 1847 style instrument that does have a wooden rim. It is much, much louder than the gourd banjo. And in a space like this, it wouldn't even need amplification. You could just hear it so easily. And there's two reasons that that change happens that I explore in the book. One is for that amplification, for that sound. You're playing it in a different performance context. But the other reason is just that it's easier to make a wooden rim banjo than it is a gourd banjo. Every time you make a gourd banjo, that gourd is going to be different. And so you have to fit that neck to that gourd every time. If you break that gourd, you will have to fit that neck, that new gourd to that neck. You can't just, grab one and think it's going to work. Whereas with the wooden rim banjo, you can even buy a product that already existed, like a tambourine, and put this neck on it and have an instrument and have kind of your proto assembly line process. This also meant that the repertoire was changing. I'm going to play a tune that's called Congo Prince Jig, and I explore kind of if you've read the book, you might understand why it's one that is found in an 1855 Blackface Minstrelsy banjo primer, one of these early books that told you, here's, banjo instruction book. Here's where you put your fingers. Here's how you pluck the strings. Here's how you tune the strings. And then here are the songs to play that you've just heard somebody perform. But that one in particular, for a few different reasons, seems like it might have some connection to an earlier African-American tradition. But it's also really hard to figure that out because these musicians were constantly making up stories about themselves to make themselves seem authentic, right? So, I learned this tune from a Black person. And kind of using that as part of their cred when they were on stage.
I'm going to play one more tune that is actually trusted by experts to be from the African American tradition. Frank Converse, he said that he wanted this to was taught from a black musician in his form of New York. Because it's kind of wrong account of the tuning of the instrument, the playing style, just lots of information. Unfortunately, it's not given to players. So we can't go and try to do a type of work based on that. But it does give us this really interesting transition that again happens after the exposure to in 1843. But we see that African American banjo tradition continues on after that, just because of Blackface Minstrelsy didn't mean that Black folks abandoned the banjo and keep changing that tradition over time. Slang this week, so.
And I think that's it. So we have time for some questions if anybody has any questions.
It's the one you played just before that you called Congo what?
Congo Prince jig.
Ah.
And so one of the things that I talk about in the book is the kind of concept of the king of the Congo was a ritual election that happened within African American communities, especially in New York, like city, upstate New York, and New Jersey. And so that the guy who has that song in his book was from that area, and New York was really kind of the hub of Blackface Minstrelsy. So the idea is kind of that maybe he was referencing that idea of the king of the Congo with Congo Prince jig. Yeah.
Sometimes I learned this one time, a tune called Congo jig. Is that a different tune, or do you know anything about that?
I don't know. I'm not sure. I'll have to look that up. Yeah.
It didn't sound like a song that I remember.
Okay.
So I think it might be two different things.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
This all came from West African enslaved people coming to North America. Is there anything on the East African side?
So part of what I talk about in the book is that so there's two things. One is that in describing these instruments, Sloan references Indians, and the Native Americans in Jamaica had been exterminated by Europeans. So there weren't any Native Americans in Jamaica at that time who were actually native to the island. And so there's been a lot of discussion about what does he mean by Indians. And one of the suggestions is that he meant Indians as in people from the Indian Ocean region of Africa. And that's why, the other thing that folks talk about a lot is the idea that, the tuning pegs and flat fingerboard of the banjo must have been a European influence. But of course, you do have Moroccan, North African instruments that could have, been known to people in West Africa. But more importantly, there were enslaved people taken from East Africa, from Tanzania, from Kenya, even from Madagascar, and they have instruments that already have these flat fingerboards and tuning pegs. So I kind of argue that we can't rule that out as a possibility of kind of one of the influences of the banjo. Yeah. Yes.
What was your experience like trying to learn these tunes from the transcribed notation to? I'm wondering about the tuning, or if it was intuitive, or that was a huge challenge.
The easy answer is that the only one that I actually learned myself from the transcription was Kalinda, which is the really simple one, which you can play basically in any style. You don't need to do claw hammer. The other ones Pete learned a long time ago and just taught me. So I can't read or write banjo tab. And I could probably figure it out if I sat down and tried to do it because I can read music because I play fiddle. So I would, if I were to do it, I think my process would be to play it on fiddle until I get the sound in my ear and then try to figure it out in banjo. But I'm a much better fiddler than I am a banjo player. So yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just curious, what the same instruments that from this fretted.
Yeah, that's a great question. So even this one, you can kind of see that it has lines. Those are actually flush frets. So they only are markers. They're not actually sticking up. And it's not until the 1860s that you start getting fretted banjos, which is interesting because there are fretted guitars already. So, it's kind of one of those questions of why didn't they bring that, technology starting in this banjo is an 1847 banjo. Why didn't they already bring that in? One potential answer for the banjo players in the room is the bridge placement. So if you have a fretted instrument, the bridge has to stay in the same place because when you put down your finger, that is the length of the thing. But I could move the bridge on that one and it would simply, if you can imagine the frets just getting closer together. And the thing about those is that the wooden rims, the pots are really big. And even though they have that tightening hardware, it's really easy for those skin heads to start sinking in humid weather, in wet weather. And so you, as a banjo player, might want to move that bridge closer to the tailpiece to stop some of that sinking, because the bridge is really where all the pressure is. If you come up and look at this, you can see that, the head sinks in right there where the bridge is. And so you might have to move it back to kind of compensate for that. And if you had frets, your banjo would just be out of tune and you wouldn't be able to play it. Whereas, if you have even flush frets, that's just kind of giving you a general idea of okay, I know how my banjo is right now. So I have to put my finger that much closer, to the nut or to the head. Yeah.
Is it is there a standardized tuning for that instrument, or is there
for the gourd? So
what do you have in there?
So that's one of the things that
First Rights is that the musician specifically said, "I'm going to throw the banjo out of tune." So you can hear that it's a C below that, and then an F, and then a G, which makes a very weird chord.
But it's still an open tuning.
But it's an open tuning, yeah. And then what I was playing the majority of them in is just literally an open chord, C, C, E, G. And we have one account where so we have that banjo player circa 1850 saying this tuning. And then we have a German guy saying that the banjo was tuned like a chord, which of course, there's lots of chords. But one of the interesting things is if you're in that C, C, E, G open major chord, one of the positions that you often go to is this with your second finger here on this string and your first finger lower on the middle string. And if you can kind of see it on the book cover here that the Haitian Banjo actually has finger wear exactly in that spot, suggesting that open chord could have been the tuning, because that would have been, the next, the fretted chord that you would go to in that open tuning. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your research process? Because so deep in stuff. And I'm a librarian and a folklorist here, so I'm especially curious about like things that were exciting to you, but also just like challenges you ran into, just like, just kind of frustration and trying to deal with special collections all over the place,
I was telling Steve earlier that I was both very fortunate to have COVID because it meant I had lots of time to work on this book. But I was also unfortunate because there were times where I wanted to, even if I couldn't travel to that archive, I wanted to call that archive and say, do you guys have any of this information? And they just weren't even open at that point. Like everybody was still at home before vaccines. So luckily I had done a good amount of research, especially at the special collections at the University of Minnesota Library. They have a very extensive rare book collection, and they have the papers of John Gabriel Stedman that I write about in the book. And I was able to go there in 2019 and stay there for 3 weeks during the polar vortex, if anybody remembers that, in Minnesota. It was intense. But that's there's the idea that, so much is digitized. I always try to push back against, because I absolutely used tons and tons of digitized records that I could access, and was very thankful that people had digitized them, put them on archive.org. But a couple of the finds that I made were just in getting every single book that was published before 1790 that, the University of Minnesota had, that, had some geographic connection to what I was talking about, and just flipping through and seeing what I could find. So there's a lot of just always praying that you're going to find something and believing that you're going to find something, and then going through lots and lots and lots and lots of stuff and not finding anything at all. And I think the other big thing for me in my kind of writing and research process is that triangulation of, we're dealing with primary source material where there might not be a lot. So for example, with the section on Hans Sloane and Mr. Baptiste, we have Sloane's record of it. We don't have any records of Mr. Baptiste. A colleague, Mary Kate Lingold, went to Jamaica and found a bunch of stuff there. And so was able to kind of piece together parts of his life. But then it was also just about figuring out what had other, people observed in Jamaica around that same time. There was an earthquake that hit Jamaica in 1691. So right after Sloane was there, which kind of really changed the landscape of of Jamaica. But the benefit was that a lot of people then wrote about like what was life like before the earthquake and after the earthquake, and getting a sense of that life. Yeah. Yeah, Tatiana, I'm back.
A little bit about the significance of the engravings on the gourd of the banjo. I love that part of the book, and I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so it's interesting because that South Carolina image, there was debate about it, about whether those were, what's going on, because even that has these crosses and asterisks. And John Rose is an amateur painter, if anybody hadn't noticed that, but he's also incredibly detailed. I was able to see this. It's in Colonial Williamsburg, and you can even see it here, but to a certain extent, he painted toenails on the dancers. This woman's legs, you can kind of like see through her skirt, that he like wanted to create the idea that her skirt was very thin. This bottle has like the glass part at the bottom. So it's incredibly detailed. So the idea was, okay, he painted those crosses and asterisks. That must be what he intended. But people kind of debated about whether that was real or not. And then when the Haitian Banjo turned up, it had cross-shaped, and it was like rediscovered in that collection in Paris in 2005. And it had these cross-shaped sound holes, not around the edge like that, but around the back. And Laurent Dubois explains in his book, The Banjo, America's African Instrument, that, these aren't Christian crosses, that these are symbols of the cosmogram, which is really very common across African American spirituality, from New York with how people were buried, to crosses that are found in outbuildings of like kitchens where enslaved people would have been forced to labor in Maryland, through the Caribbean. So you see this cosmogram all over the place. It comes from Congo spirituality and basically represents the intersection of the earthly and the spiritual plane. So we are all in this earthly plane here, and the spiritual plane goes up and down, and it connects us to the underworld and spirits that are there, and the ancestors and spirits and gods that are above. And so we think about how that continues on. Where does Robert Johnson meet the devil? At the crossroads to get his ability to play the guitar. And so this appears over and over and over again. And one of the things that kind of briefly mentioned is that this banjo is not constructed like the historic banjos, like the Haitian bancha, because it's been made more playable to have a better action. And so if this was historically accurate, if it was kind of more of a reproduction, that neck also creates a cosmogram with the banjo itself, of having the neck be the connector to the spiritual plane, and literally bisects the gourd. So enters right here in the middle and comes out right at the nub at the bottom. And that is kind of the not only how the banjo is described in the historical record of how it's constructed with the side cut off, but how the instruments themselves, all of the existing instruments that we have, are created like that. And even the drawings, even the images seem to be like that as well. So that was kind of, I was talking to Pete about the cosmogram, and he could never figure out why these instruments had this kind of incredibly high action. Because if you imagine, the bridge is still at the same place and the neck is going like this, that means that these strings are, it's basically impossible to play above the the short string. Because you end up, imagine instead of me pressing the string down to here, that this, fingerboard is all the way back here, right? So you have to put an amazing amount of pressure to get that string down. And Pete could never figure out why it was constructed that way because, like said, you can see on the accounting, the bridge is kind of high, but it goes up pretty far, and you get something like an ingoni, and these players are really virtuosic and can go up the fingerboard. And we see that on those instruments too, that you could play it, all the way up here. And so Pete's like, well, you could, the people who made these instruments could have constructed it differently. They could have constructed it exactly like Pete did for this one. Why didn't they do that? And that's when we started talking about, the spirituality of the instrument and the cosmograms on it itself, and figuring, thinking, okay, that is an explanation for why it would be constructed in this way. I had one person asked me in an interview, like, is this the final word on banjo, early banjo research? And I said, absolutely not. One of the things that I write in the kind of afterword is about the discovery. Literally type, had written, I was dragging my feet on writing the very end of the book, where I was interviewing a lot of friends, contemporary Black banjo players, and just didn't want to do that part for whatever reason. So I'd written parts of it, but not all of it. And then in the midst of that, Pete gets an email with somebody basically being like, I think I found a banjo. And lo and behold, it's definitely an early banjo. It looks really, really similar to the Haitian banjo. And so that's all to say that there's, kind of to the archival question, there's still stuff that's being turned up in archives and museums. And my hope is that people kind of continue on and find that information, and we build on this research so that it's not hidden and lost anymore, but rather something that we all know and can spread the banjo gospel. Thank you.
Thank everybody for coming out. Thank you, Kristina. Another round of applause. Again for coming. Please help yourself to the food that's in the back.